We'd like to welcome back to Freedom Now our dear brother Johnny Achi, who is with the Arab Americans for Syria. Welcome back to Freedom Now.
Hello, Sister Tej. Thanks for having me again on your show.
Thank you for being here. Can you give us an update, brother, on what is happening in Syria?
Sure. I think thanks to the recent advances made and gains made by the Syrian Army across the whole country, mainly in the north, the eastern part of Aleppo, many villages has been freed within last week. Around Damascus, the suburbs of Damascus has been completely freed. An agreement was made with some of the fighters to move them to Idlib, which freed a lot of hostages that were captured and been there for over 2 years. We might, if we get a chance, talk about that a little bit later on. They met with the President Bashar Assad yesterday, and it was a really moving video that I saw. I would like to talk about maybe if we have time. With all that gain, especially also in the south, the Syrian army is moving in the south in Daraa, which is a very important area because there's an area there where Iraq, Jordan, and Syria met, in that triangle there. There's a big challenge because the US-led coalition is trying to maintain a presence there. However, the Syrian Iraqi has reached the Syrian border from the other side. So now we know very soon the Syrian army and the Iraqi army gonna meet in that area. And that's the first time since the crisis has begun that ISIS has been pushed out from both sides of the borders. So yet to see what's going to happen in the next few days. But I think the situation has been a lot calmer than any time during this conflict, this past few months. Throughout government-controlled areas, including some areas that were recently freed by the Syrian army from the terrorists, you see signs of hope. You see people returning to these liberated areas. You see some buildings and streets being cleared of rubbles. Some reconstructions is underway, even in the city of Aleppo itself. Some rehabilitations projects are taking place. People are recovering a kind of normalcy again. They're trying to get back to the normal life. There is a profound challenges, of course, up ahead. The international sanctions continue to be a big burden on the Syrian people. I think that is going to be the next burden, the next hurdle to pass if we can get over that enormous economic suffering and pressure that is pushed upon the Syrian people by the West. We could really eventually move to a much bigger and better place. So that's on the military aspect of it. Many people in the face of so much pain and suffering, like I said, are standing up, and I think eventually they're going to prevail. It is high time that the world allow the country to fulfill its capacity to choose its own future. This is what we need to come to the conclusion. Let the Syrian people find their own peace. Let them find their own democracy, and let them find their own freedom in the way they know how. Let them choose who they want to lead them through this. I want to talk about the news today. I was reading just before I came in here that the Syrian army troops seized a number of US-made Humvees, the Humvees armored vehicles. They captured an area from ISIS in the desert in eastern Homs, and they captured many of these fully equipped Humvees. Also in the news today, the Pentagon will allocate $2 billion from the $64 billion that they have for what they call foreign operations or abroad operations. They have a budget of $64 billion just for abroad operations. They are going to allocate $2 billion to say for Iraq and Syria to fight ISIS. So one would think that the Iraqi and Syrian armies are going to get that aid, if we want to call it aid. It turns out differently. While the Iraqi army might be getting his share of the $2 billion, it is different when it comes to Syria. It is the different fighting Syrian forces who are going to get the Syrian shares of the money, not the Syrian army. As a matter of fact, the money will not go to fight ISIS, but to fight the only force fighting ISIS in Syria on the ground, and that is the Syrian army. So how would I know that? Of course, the proof is very simple. Few days ago on May 30th, and everybody can see that video, the Russian aircraft over Syria attacked a column, I believe about 39 armed trucks carrying loads of ISIS fighters out of Raqqa, where it's increasingly surrounded. That's their capital, de facto capital, Raqqa. The convoy apparently was on its way to the ancient and contested city of Palmyra again. You know, we've talked about Palmyra, the ancient city, and how close is it to Damascus, and how it fell twice in the hands of ISIS and it was recaptured by the Syrian army, even though the West would say it was fallen again in the Syrian army's hands. So for the West, it's recaptured by ISIS, but it fell again in the Syrian army's hand. This is the terminology that the West uses. So in this attack that just happened on May 30th, 120 ISIS fighters were killed in the air raid. So you might say, so what's the proof? How is that showing that the U.S. is arming different groups to fight the Syrian army? The question here is, how did these 39 armed trucks escape the U.S.-led coalition forces? And worse, who gave these the safe passage out of Raqqa and into Palmyra? Isn't it a bit surprising that they weren't identified and attacked by the U.S.-led coalition forces? This area that we're talking about, the skies over that area, Raqqa, it is buzzing with surveillance aircraft. The surveillance aircraft that some are here uniquely built and equipped to detect the large mechanized armored vehicles moving on the road there. So the truth is, as it was explained by the Russian foreign minister, that the Russians have all the evidence that it was the U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces. This is the U.S.-backed forces that the U.S. is helping, or supposed to be sending the money to. They are, of course, in the north of and west of Raqqa. That these forces were surveillance and were taped, given safe way passage to these fighters to leave Raqqa and to head south to fight the Syrian army in the south and to get close to Damascus, hopefully eventually invading the capital. So, of course, the SDF, or the Syrian Democratic Forces, have denied the charges, even though they have officially made 2 safe passage deals with ISIS terrorists in the past. And these information are confirmed by the U.S.-led coalition. I've read it here in U.S. reports back in March of 2017 and late 16. Once in Tabqa, when they allowed 70 ISIS fighters to leave the Tabqa. And second time was when they allowed 500 vehicles with ISIS fighters leave the city of Manbij, when they had actually with them civilians that were taken hostages, and they were relieved by the Syrian Defense Forces to give them safe passage to leave Manjab and go wherever they want to go. So here again, we come to the conclusion that the money that the U.S. government continue to send to Syria and the weapons they continue to send to Syria end up in the hands of ISIS, evidenced by the Humvees that were just captured by the Syrian army. And the Syrian Democratic Forces in the north that they were supposed to be fighting ISIS, they are not fighting ISIS. They're given safe passage to ISIS to go and fight the Syrian army. These are proven facts. So this is all to say that the U.S. and the U.S.-backed groups on the ground in Syria are not interested in ISIS. They are really there for the big fish. It is, as we always said on the show, a regime change proxy war under the pretext of fighting ISIS. And that is our story that we've been telling for the last 5 and 6 years. We've proven one evidence after another evidence that the U.S. presence in Syria is not to fight terrorism, it's to maintain presence and destroy the Syrian state as we know it, and for the eventual goal of regime change in Syria, illegal regime change in Syria.
And again, we are speaking with Brother Johnny Achi, who is with the Arab Americans for Syria and who has been reporting on the other side of the story since 2011 here at Freedom Now. And so, Brother Johnny, can you talk to us about the recent demonstration organized by Arab Americans for Syria?
The protest we went out last week against a prominent member of the KPFK family. We were there protesting not to disturb anything, not to, oppose Amy Goodman, but just to shed the light that the people who have trusted over the years have not presented the facts, and they are taking parts in the destruction of Syria. People were coming into the event, and we were just standing outside peacefully with some signs. I was carrying signs saying, Amy, stop beating the drums of wars on Syria. They were saying, how is that possible? I think when you represent only one side of the story and not both sides of the story, you are taking part in the criminal activity that's taken in that place. You are continuing to beat the drums of war. We have been for years trying, and I've been coming on your show, Sister Tej, thank you so much, and on the Dawn show for all these years, but we have wondered and wished to be able to have a broad presence on different shows, just to have the other side of the story. For years, Amy presented only one side. When she wanted to talk about the Syrian story, she always presented the opposition, as if the people like myself and more than 70% of the Syrian populations, that's by Western report, that 70% of the Syrian population support their government against these terrorist groups. Call them moderate, call them vetted rebels, whatever you want to call them. Anyone who carries weapons against his own people and his own army is considered terrorist in the eyes of Syrians. We were never given a chance. They demonize our government, they demonize our army, they demonize our president. This President Assad, who just met today with those 34 of these hostages that have been kept in dungeons for 2 years, some women, some men. Him and his wife, Asma, met with these, and they had a long talk, and some of it was video. And I encourage people to watch it, even though it's not really in English, it's in Arabic. But I put some content of this. He said they, the terrorist groups want us to be hateful like they are. We will not sink to hatred. We are working to promote love. In fact, their demise is precisely in promoting love and not allowing hate a place in our hearts. Vengeance has no place. Vengeance would be a grave loss for all Syrians. Had we been acting out of vengeance, we would not have been able to bring the hostage situation to success. We would not have been able to free you guys. Yet ultimately he says that love is promoted and supported by our brave and honorable men in the Syrian army who have sacrificed their lives so you can be freed. This is the president today meeting with these hostages that were finally freed because of the effort of the Syrian army. They made a deal. They drove all the terrorists out in buses to Idlib, what we have been doing, the reconciliation programs all over Syria, mainly to free hostages, to get normalcy back to the cities, to free the cities from the threat of terrorism. And so this is our president that we take pride. He was re-elected, freely re-elected by the majority of the Syrians in 2014. So it's time for the West to respect the wishes of the Syrians. And if we do want to talk about the Syrian issue again, we need to present both sides of the story. Would love to see or hear a true patriot voice of a true Syrian, who, by the way, thousands exist of them here in Southern California. Okay, so it's not like a lack of Syrian who support their country and their army. So we would love to hear their side of the story sometimes on some of these prominent shows, and that was the reason we were there.
And can you give some contact information also for Arab Americans for Syria, Brother Johnny?
Sure, you can see us on Facebook at facebook.com/AA4Syria, just the number 4. On Twitter, also AA4Syria.
And again, we've been speaking with Brother Johnny Achi, who is with Arab Americans for Syria, who's been reporting here on Freedom Now since 2011.
Correct.
And give thanks to you, brother.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.